Hey guys, tonight let's just say we're taking a little trip back in time. Imagine, if you will, the warm Mediterranean air on your skin, the scent of wood smoke and something vaguely spicy, maybe a hint of baking bread, but also something else, something a bit more pungent. You're standing on uneven cobblestones, the sound of a bustling city, a cacophony of voices in a language you don't quite understand, the rattle of cartwheels, the distant braying of a donkey. This isn't just any ancient city, this is Rome, a place of magnificent marble and monumental ambition, but also a place where life could be incredibly cheap, and justice. Well, justice had a distinctly sharp edge. You probably won't survive this with all your modern sensibilities intact, if we're being honest. But that's why we're here, to peek into the shadows. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel grow, and lets me know you appreciate these little nocturnal journeys. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see our little community spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself blinking, disoriented, in the heart of a sprawling metropolis. The sheer scale of it is breathtaking. Buildings climb towards the sky, columns gleaming in the hazy sunlight. But beneath the grandeur, there's an undeniable grit. Dust kicks up from the unpaved patches between the grand thoroughfares, and the noise. Oh, the noise is a constant pressing wave. You try to get your bearings, but every corner turn reveals another bustling street, another throng of people. Toqued citizens striding with purpose, slaves hurrying on errands, merchants hawking their wares with practiced cries. It's a vibrant, chaotic dance, and you're an uninvited guest trying not to trip over a stray chicken or bump into a stern-faced legionary whose gaze seems to pierce right through you. That gaze is a silent reminder. This city, for all its life, operates on a strict set of rules, and the consequences for breaking them can be memorable, to say the least. This is ancient Rome, and you've arrived at a time when its legal system, the very bedrock of Western jurisprudence, is also a source of some of the most inventive and terrifying methods of punishment ever conceived. Forget the nuanced complexities of modern law. Here, justice is often a blunt instrument, wielded with a chilling efficiency. The Romans valued order, pax romana, above almost all else, and their methods for maintaining it could be swift and severe. There wasn't always a lengthy appeals process, no phalanx of lawyers debating obscure precedents for months on end. Sometimes it felt like one wrong word, one ill-judged action, and you could find yourself on a very fast track to a very unpleasant outcome. You might even say their customer service for criminal complaints was aggressively streamlined. At the very foundation of this system, etched into the collective Roman consciousness, are the 12 tables. Picture this. Around 450 BC, after a long struggle between the wealthy patricians and the common plebeians, a commission was supposedly sent to Greece to study their laws, and upon their return 10 men, the decemvirs, drafted a set of laws. These weren't flowery philosophical treatises. They were stark, practical, and to our ears, often brutal. Displayed publicly in the forum, likely on bronze tablets, they were meant to ensure that laws were known to all, preventing arbitrary judgments by magistrates. This was a huge step, theoretically. For the first time, the rules were written down for everyone to see, covering everything from property rights and debt to family law and, crucially, penalties for crimes. And some of those penalties, well, they didn't mess around. If a thief was caught in the act at night, the tables permitted them to be killed on the spot. If they were caught by day, they could be scourged and handed over to the person they'd robbed. It's a far cry from a caution and community service, isn't it? The city around you pulses with this undercurrent of strict, unyielding law. You see it in the way people defer to officials, the quick, nervous glances when a magistrate's lictors, those imposing bodyguards carrying bundles of rods and an axe pass by. Those rods weren't just for show. They symbolized the state's power to flog, and the axe, its power to execute. And the Romans, bless their organized hearts, were very keen on symbolism. Historians still argue whether the full, unvarnished harshness of the early 12 tables was consistently applied in daily life, or if some of its more severe clauses served more as a terrifying deterrent a legal boogeyman to keep the populace in line? Perhaps it was a bit of both, the ever-present threat being as powerful as the occasional brutal example. One particularly charming little tidbit from this early period, underscoring how seriously they took public order and reputation, was the punishment for oxentatio. That's composing or singing a slanderous song about someone. If you were found guilty of publicly defaming someone with a catchy but nasty tune, the 12 tables prescribed a rather final form of censorship, being clubbed to death. Imagine that. Your diss track could literally be the death of you. It makes you think twice about posting that spicy meme, doesn't it? It highlights a society deeply concerned with honour and public face, where words could indeed lead to sticks and stones, or in this case, a very large club. As you navigate these ancient streets, the weight of this legal framework feels almost palpable. It's in the air you breathe, in the wary expressions of the people you pass. The Forum, the heart of Roman public life, isn't just a marketplace or a social hub. It's also where justice is dispensed, often very publicly. Trials would take place, sentences would be pronounced, and the populace would gather to watch. Forget your streaming services. For the Romans, the drama of the courts and the subsequent enforcement of sentences were primetime entertainment, a constant vivid reminder of the state's power and the price of transgression. One can almost imagine the vendors selling snacks, like some sort of macabre sporting event. Get your roasted dormice, freshly roasted dormice for the flogging. Too much? Probably. This sense of order, maintained by such a formidable and often frightening legal system, is what allowed Rome to grow from a small city-state into a vast empire. But as we're about to discover, the methods used to enforce that order often strayed into territories that, to us, seem utterly bizarre, disproportionate, and designed not just to punish the body, but to terrify the soul and obliterate the individual. The punishments weren't just about retribution, they were about spectacle, about reinforcing social hierarchies, and about making an example so vivid, so horrifying, that others would think twice, or even thrice, before stepping out of line. So, as the shadows begin to lengthen across the Forum and the first oil lamps flicker to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the ancient stone, you feel a prickle of unease. You've only just scratched the surface of Roman justice. The gleaming marble of the temples and public buildings hides a darker side, a world of dungeons, arenas, and execution grounds, where the ingenuity of the Roman mind was applied not to engineering aqueducts or crafting poetry, but to devising ways to inflict pain and ultimate retribution. The dawn of Roman law was indeed a new beginning for legal principles, but it also cast a very long, very dark shadow, a shadow we're about to step into. The foundation has been laid, the rules established, and now you're about to see how those rules were enforced when someone truly, or sometimes just allegedly, crossed the line. The air grows a little colder, doesn't it? You're drawn, almost against your will, towards a hushed gathering near the Tiber River. The usual boisterous sounds of the city seem muted here, replaced by a nervous anticipation. There's a strange sort of procession. Guards are escorting a condemned individual, their face a mask of terror, towards the murky, swirling waters, and then you see it. The sack. Not just any sack, but a large, ominous leather bag, unsettlingly capacious. This, my friend, is the infamous pinacule, the punishment of the sack, reserved for one of the most heinous crimes in Roman eyes. Parricide, the murder of one's own father, or by extension, other close male relatives. Though, as with many things Roman, the exact scope of parricide evolved over time. Sometimes it included mothers, sometimes grandfathers. The Romans weren't always perfectly consistent, except in their desire for a truly memorable punishment for this particular offence. The sack itself isn't empty. As the condemned is forced closer, you catch glimpses of what's being prepared. Into this bag, along with the unfortunate human, an assortment of live animals were to be placed. The traditional, almost folkloric combination included a dog, a rooster, a viper, and an ape. Yes, you heard that right. An ape. Historians still argue whether this precise menagerie was always used, or if it was more of a symbolic ideal, with available local fauna sometimes substituting for the more exotic elements. It's like a nightmarish party mix where no one gets to choose the music or the company. Try explaining that to your Uber driver on the way to the river. Just dropping off a friend, and his new roommates. The logic behind this bizarre cocktail of creatures is debated, but it's thought that each animal symbolized a particular aspect of the crime, or an affront to the gods. The dog, for instance, might represent the desecration of filial piety, as dogs were often seen as loyal companions. The rooster, perhaps an emblem of wakefulness and vigilance, now perversely accompanying the condemned into an eternal sleep. The viper, an obvious symbol of treachery and poison. And the ape? Well, the ape was often seen as a grotesque parody of a human, perhaps symbolizing the subhuman nature of someone who could commit such a crime. It's a chilling piece of psychological warfare, this forced companionship in death. One mainstream historical fact here is that the poena sulae is one of the few Roman punishments that seems almost entirely unique to them, with few direct parallels in other ancient legal systems. It was their special brand of horror, reserved for what they considered an ultimate betrayal of family and societal order. You watch, a knot tightening in your stomach, as the grim ritual unfolds. The condemned, often after being scourged with virgi sanguina, blood-red rods, just to add a bit of colour literally, would be sewn into the oxhide sack with these unwilling companions. Imagine the sheer terror, the claustrophobia, the scratching, biting and hissing in that suffocating darkness as the bag is sealed. It's a scene designed to evoke maximum revulsion and fear, not just in the victim, but in any onlookers. This wasn't a quick, clean execution. It was a prelude to a terrifying, messy end. Once sealed, the sack was then typically thrown into a body of water, a river like the Tiber, or sometimes the sea. If no suitable body of water was nearby, some accounts suggest the condemned, still in their animal-packed sack, might be thrown to wild beasts in the arena instead, a sort of 2-for-1 special on Roman brutality. The idea was not just death, but utter obliteration, a denial of a proper burial and consignment to a watery anonymous grave, shared with creatures symbolizing the depravity of the crime. It was a punishment that aimed to erase the offender from the community, both physically and symbolically. One particularly quirky, or perhaps just grimly practical aspect of the poena culae involved the footwear of the condemned. According to some sources, the parricide was made to wear wooden shoes, or soleil ligny, before being placed in the sack. The purpose? To prevent them from contaminating the sacred earth of Rome with their final steps before their unholy demise. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the Roman obsession with ritual purity, and the profound pollution they believed such a crime brought upon the state. You can almost hear the magistrate, "All right, Johnson, you're about to be sewn into a bag with a viper and a monkey, but for Jupiter's sake, put on these wooden clogs first. We have standards." The crowd observes in a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. This isn't something you see every day, even in Rome. The poena culae was reserved for the truly reviled. Its very theatricality served as a potent warning. It wasn't just about dispatching a criminal, it was about reinforcing the sanctity of the paterfamilias, the head of the Roman family, whose authority was a microcosm of the state's authority. To kill him was to strike at the heart of Roman society. As the sack hits the water with a sickening splash and is quickly pulled under by the current, a collective shudder seems to pass through the onlookers. The ripples spread, then slowly dissipate, leaving the surface of the Tiber looking as indifferent as ever. But everyone who witnessed it carries the image away with them. It's a story they'll tell, a warning they'll heed. The Romans understood the power of narrative, the enduring impact of a truly horrifying spectacle. This punishment, with its almost mythical cruelty, endured for centuries, though its application waxed and waned. Emperors like Augustus and Hadrian reinforced its use, ensuring it remained a vivid part of the Roman legal toolkit. Even as Roman law became more codified and in some areas arguably more humane, a very relative term here, the poena culae stood as a stark reminder of the ancient visceral horror the state could unleash. It's a long way from a fine or a few years in a relatively modern correctional facility. This was a sentence designed to echo in the nightmares of the populace. You turn away from the riverbank, the image of that submerged sack seared into your mind. The sun still shines, the vendors still call out their wares in the distance, but the city feels a little darker now, its foundations shaken by the brutal efficiency of its justice. You realise that the order Rome prided itself on was maintained not just by legions and laws, but by a calculated and public embrace of the terrifying. And the sack, with its writhing, doomed contents, was one of its most potent symbols. It makes you appreciate the simple, unadorned comfort of your own bed, doesn't it? No vipers, no apes, just, hopefully, a peaceful night's sleep. But for the parricide in ancient Rome, sleep, and indeed life itself, ended in a uniquely horrifying fashion. The scene shifts, the murky waters of the Tiber giving way to a dusty sun-baked hill just outside the city walls, or perhaps a busy crossroads. Here, another kind of spectacle is underway, one that would become chillingly synonymous with Roman power and ruthlessness: crucifixion. You see not one, but several rough-hewn wooden crosses silhouetted against the sky. On them, figures are suspended, their bodies contorted in agony. This isn't a quick death. It's a slow, agonizing public execution designed for maximum suffering and deterrence. Unlike the uniquely Roman pinacule we just witnessed, crucifixion was a punishment the Romans adopted and refined, but didn't invent. Its origins are murky, possibly tracing back to the Persians or Assyrians, but it was the Romans who perfected it as an instrument of state terror. You approach, a sense of dread mixing with a grim curiosity that seems to be a common human failing in these situations. The air is thick with the sounds of suffering, groans, occasional cries, the buzzing of flies, and the smell of sweat, blood, and despair. This was a punishment reserved primarily for slaves, the lowest classes, rebels, pirates, and despised enemies of the state. Roman citizens, by law, were generally exempt from this particularly ignominious fate, at least until the later imperial period when rules sometimes became more flexible, shall we say, especially for crimes like treason. It was considered the summum supplicium, the supreme penalty, a mark of ultimate degradation. If you were a Roman citizen, you'd typically be granted a swifter, cleaner death, like beheading. But for those deemed outside the protection of Roman dignity, the cross awaited. The process itself was brutal from start to finish. The condemned was usually scourged first, a vicious whipping with a flagrum, a whip with multiple leather thongs embedded with sharp pieces of bone or metal. This pre-crucifixion flogging was so severe that it could flay the skin from the back, exposing muscle and bone, and sometimes even prove fatal on its own. It wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was about weakening the victim, hastening their eventual demise on the cross, and starting the process of public humiliation. Then, the condemned was often forced to carry the patibulum, the heavy horizontal crossbeam, to the site of execution. The upright post, or stipes, was typically already fixed in the ground. Imagine that agonizing journey, weakened by blood loss, jeered at by crowds, each step a monumental effort. It was part of the spectacle, a public shaming parade. You can almost hear the Roman equivalent of shame, 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 ringing out, though probably with more inventive Latin curses. Once at the execution site, the victim was stripped naked, another layer of humiliation. Their arms were then either nailed or tied to the patibulum. There's a long-standing debate, a classic open scholarly debate phrase for you, about whether nails or ropes were more common, or if it varied. Archaeological evidence, like the Yohanan ben Hagalgol discovery in Jerusalem, an ankle bone pierced by a Roman nail, confirms that nailing definitely occurred. The nails, long and roughly square, would be driven through the wrists, often mistaken for the palms in popular imagery, but the wrist bones could better support the body's weight, and sometimes through the feet, either separately or with one nail pinning both. The patibulum was then hoisted onto the upright post. Death by crucifixion was a torturous, lingering affair. It wasn't primarily due to blood loss from the nailing, but from a slow process of asphyxiation. To breathe, the victim would have to push up on their nailed feet or pull up on their nailed wrists to relieve the pressure on their chest muscles and diaphragm. This would cause excruciating pain in the wounds and eventually lead to exhaustion. The position also put immense strain on the joints, leading to dislocations. Dehydration, shock, and infection would also play their parts. It could take hours, sometimes days, for death to finally arrive. A grim, mainstream historical fact is that victims of crucifixion sometimes had their legs broken by the executioners, a practice called crurifragium, to hasten death by preventing them from pushing up to breathe, leading to quicker suffocation. It was a mercy killing, Roman style. The public nature of crucifixion was crucial. Crosses were erected in prominent places, along roadsides, on hills, near city gates, or even in amphitheatres as part of the games. This wasn't hidden away. It was a very visible warning. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. It was political theatre of the most brutal kind. Think about the slave revolt led by Spartacus. After his defeat in 71 BC, over 6,000 of his captured followers were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road leading south from Rome. Imagine travelling that road, mile after mile lined with dying men, a grotesque avenue of agony. The message was unmistakable: resist, and this will be your fate. It's hard to imagine a more effective deterrent, or a more horrifying travel brochure. Visit sunny Italy. Enjoy the local scenery and the thousands of slowly dying rebels. One quirky, or rather deeply cynical tidbit concerning Roman crucifixion is that the bodies were often left on the crosses for days, sometimes weeks, to rot and be picked at by birds and wild animals. This denied the victim a proper burial, which was hugely important in Roman religious belief for the peace of the soul in the afterlife. It was the ultimate insult, an extension of the punishment beyond death itself. This practice also served as a constant festering reminder to the populace. You couldn't just ignore it. The sight and smell would be unavoidable. The soldiers overseeing the crucifixions were often hardened and indifferent, sometimes gambling at the foot of the cross, as depicted in later Christian narratives. They might offer the victim a drink of posca, a cheap sour wine mixed with water commonly drunk by soldiers, sometimes on a sponge on a hyssop branch. Whether this was an act of minimal compassion, a way to prolong consciousness, and thus suffering, or simply a routine gesture, is open to interpretation. As you stand there, watching the slow, inexorable decline of the figures on the crosses, the sun beating down, the flies buzzing more insistently, you realise the profound psychological impact this practice must have had. It wasn't just about physical pain. It was about stripping away every shred of dignity, about making an example so terrible that it would be seared into the collective memory. The cross, before it became a symbol of Christian faith, was a potent symbol of Roman imperial might and its capacity for extreme cruelty. It was a tool of social control, a way of saying, we own you, body and soul, and even in death, we can dishonour you. The slow agony it promised was a fate many would do almost anything to avoid, which of course was precisely the point. The silence on that hill, broken only by the whispers of pain, speaks volumes about the price of Roman order. The brutal tableau of the crucifixions fades, only to be replaced by the roaring cacophony of the Roman arena. You find yourself not in the stands this time, but on the hot, blood-stained sand itself. The crowd is a blur of faces, a wall of sound, cheers, jeers, and a palpable, almost predatory excitement. This isn't a gladiatorial contest you've willingly entered. You're here for damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was another jewel in Rome's crown of terrifying punishments, a spectacle that combined public execution with the thrill of the hunt, except you, my friend, are the prey. It's like being the unwilling star of the deadliest reality show ever conceived, and the ratings are, quite literally, to die for. This form of execution was particularly favoured for criminals of lower status, prisoners of war, and in later periods, increasingly for Christians who refused to renounce their faith. Roman citizens were, again, generally shielded from this fate, at least in the early days. The thinking was, if you're going to execute someone, why not make it entertaining? The Roman populace had a seemingly insatiable appetite for these bloody spectacles known as venations, hunts, which often formed part of the midday entertainment during the games, a sort of gruesome interlude between the morning beast fights and the afternoon gladiatorial combats. Not sure what to do for lunch? How about watching a few lions dismember some criminals? Builds up an appetite. A sentiment probably not found in Roman cookbooks, but you get the idea. The condemned were often brought into the arena with little or no means of defence. Sometimes they were tied to stakes, unable to move. Other times they might be given a mock weapon, a flimsy wooden sword perhaps, to create a fleeting, pathetic illusion of a contest. The beasts themselves were a varied and exotic collection, sourced from the farthest reaches of the empire. Lions from North Africa, bears from Caledonia, leopards, bulls, even crocodiles if the arena could be flooded. A mainstream historical fact is that the sheer scale of these animal imports for the arena had a devastating impact on wildlife populations in some regions. The Romans effectively hunted some species to near extinction in their native habitats just to provide fodder for the games. The environmental impact statement for the Colosseum would have been a grim read. You stand there, heart hammering against your ribs as the heavy gates at one end of the arena rumble open. The roar of the crowd intensifies, a wave of sound that washes over you. Then, out charges the animal. Perhaps a snarling lion, its eyes fixed on you, or a lumbering bear, agitated and confused by the noise and the unfamiliar surroundings. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The sandy floor offers no cover, the high walls of the arena no escape. It's a primal, terrifying confrontation, stripped of all pretense of civilization. Your only companions are fear and the roar of thousands baying for blood. Historians still argue whether Damnatio ad Bestias was primarily about the swiftness of death or the spectacle of terror and suffering. While a powerful beast might dispatch a victim relatively quickly, the process leading up to that moment was one of intense psychological torment. And sometimes, death wasn't swift at all. Animals might toy with their victims or inflict multiple wounds before the fatal one. The showmanship was key. Professional beast handlers, called bestiari, would often be in the arena to guide the animals, ensuring they attacked the condemned and not, say, wandered off to take a nap in a shady corner, which would be terribly anticlimactic for the paying customers. One rather quirky, or perhaps just grimly efficient aspect of these spectacles was the attention paid to the cleanup. After a victim was mauled, attendants dressed as Charon, the mythical ferryman of the underworld, or Mercury, would enter the arena. They might poke the bodies with heated irons to ensure they were truly dead, a sort of quality control for corpses. Then, the bodies would be unceremoniously dragged out, often with hooks, and the sand raked over to prepare for the next act. It was a disturbingly organised affair, this machinery of death and entertainment. You can almost imagine the stagehands backstage. Okay, lions are done, send in the bears, and someone get a mop for aisle 3. The condemned were sometimes dressed in elaborate costumes to enhance the spectacle. For example, those convicted of arson might be forced to wear a tunica molesta, a garment soaked in pitch or other flammable substances, and then set alight, running around as human torches before or during the animal attacks, a truly horrific combination punishment. Or, in a twisted mythological reenactment, a criminal might be dressed as a figure from myth who suffered a gruesome fate, like Orpheus being torn apart by Maenads, though in this case it would be actual wild animals, not frenzied women. This added a layer of grotesque artistry to the proceedings, turning brutal execution into a perverse form of theatre. The psychological impact on those forced to participate, even if they somehow, miraculously, survived an initial encounter, perhaps by some fluke, or the intervention of a bestiarius, if the show wasn't going as planned, would be unimaginable. But survival was rare. This punishment was designed to be fatal, and to be horrifyingly public. It reinforced the power of the state, demonstrating its ability to command not just human life, but the wild, terrifying forces of nature itself, all for the amusement and warning of its citizens. As you watch the scene unfold, the desperate, futile attempts of the condemned to evade the inevitable, the savage grace of the attacking beast, the ecstatic roar of the crowd, you're struck by the raw, brutal power of it all. It's a chilling reminder of how differently life and death were valued. This wasn't just punishment, it was a statement that certain lives were disposable, certain crimes so heinous, or certain individuals so inconvenient to the state, that their end should be a public feast of terror. The dust, the noise, the smell of blood and fear, it's overwhelming. You feel a desperate urge to look away, but like the Roman crowd, there's a morbid compulsion to watch, to understand how human beings could devise and enjoy such a spectacle. The arena, often seen as a symbol of Roman engineering and entertainment, also stands as a monument to its capacity for calculated cruelty. And as the sands are once again raked smooth, ready for the next victim, you carry away the chilling understanding that for some, the roar of the crowd was the last sound they ever heard, their final moments a terrifying blur of teeth, claws, and public amusement. The roar of the arena crowd still echoes in your ears, but the scene shifts slightly. You're still on the sun-scorched sand, the smell of blood and fear lingering, but now there's a different kind of anticipation in the air. Instead of a cowering, unarmed victim awaiting a wild beast, you see individuals, often rough-looking and bearing the marks of a hard life, being equipped with weapons, a short sword, a shield, perhaps a trident and net. These are not the celebrated, highly trained gladiators who chose this life, or were forced into it but gained fame and fortune. These are the damnati ad ludum, those condemned to the gladiatorial school and ultimately to fight in the arena. It's a subtle distinction from damnatio ad bestias, but a distinction nonetheless. Here, you're not just thrown to the animals, you're given a weapon and a slim, almost insulting chance to survive by killing others in the same predicament. It's like a lottery, where the prize is simply living to die another day, probably in a similarly brutal fashion. This punishment was often meted out to serious criminals, prisoners of war or rebellious slaves who were deemed strong enough to put up a fight and provide some entertainment before their inevitable demise. While some gladiators were volunteers or professionals, a significant number were condemned men. Their sentence was effectively death by combat. They were sent to a ludus, a gladiatorial school, not so much to become skilled artisans of war, but to learn just enough to make their fights last a little longer, be a bit more spectacular. Their training would be harsh, their lives entirely controlled by the lanista, the owner and trainer of gladiators, often a man of low social standing but considerable power within his own brutal domain. You can. Imagine the pep talks. All right, men, most of you are going to die horribly, but try to make it look good for the emperor, okay? Enthusiasm. The difference between these condemned fighters and the star gladiators was significant. Professional gladiators, despite their often slave origins, could achieve a strange kind of celebrity status, earning money, fame, and even, in rare cases, their freedom, symbolised by the rudi, a wooden sword. They had fans, and their images might appear in mosaics or graffiti. The damnati ad ludum, however, were generally viewed as disposable. They were there to die, and the crowd knew it. Their fights were often less about skill and more about brutal, desperate survival. A mainstream historical fact is that gladiatorial combat, while incredibly violent, operated under certain rules and was often overseen by a referee. It wasn't always a fight to the death, especially for valuable trained gladiators. However, for the damnatskaya, the expectation of fatality was much higher. You watch as these condemned men are herded into the arena. There's a grim resignation in their eyes, mixed with a flicker of primal fear and perhaps a desperate resolve. They know the odds are stacked against them. Even if they survive one fight, there will be another and another until their luck runs out. The crowd, sated from the venations and perhaps a light midday snack of roasted dormice, remember those, is now eager for human-on-human combat. They scrutinise the combatants, placing informal bets, shouting encouragement or derision. It's a raw, visceral form of entertainment, and you're uncomfortably close to the action. Historians still argue whether there was any genuine prospect of long-term survival or eventual freedom for those condemned ad ludum. While stories of exceptional individuals fighting their way to freedom exist, they were likely the very rare exception for this category of condemned. For most, the ad ludus was simply a holding pen, a place where their deaths were staged and managed for maximum spectacle. It was a slightly more elaborate, more sporting way to die than being tied to a stake for the lions, but the end result was usually the same. One quirky, or rather bleakly pragmatic aspect of the gladiatorial system involving the condemned was the leasing of criminals. Provincial governors or other officials might sentence criminals ad ludum and then lease them out to a lanista, or an event organiser, for a fee. This meant the state could dispose of its undesirables, provide entertainment for the masses, and even make a bit of revenue in the process. It was a grimly efficient cycle of condemnation, exploitation, and death. Talk about a public-private partnership with a very high attrition rate. Get your condemned criminals here, freshly sentenced, moderately trained, guaranteed to bleed, special bulk discounts available. The fights themselves are brutal, chaotic affairs. These aren't the polished, almost balletic duels you might imagine from Hollywood depictions of famous gladiators. This is clumsy, desperate fighting, driven by fear and the instinct to survive just a few more minutes. Swords clash, shields splinter, and the sand soaks up more blood. When a man falls, wounded and helpless, the crowd often decides his fate. A thumbs-up gesture. Polis verso. Though the exact nature of the thumb gesture is still debated by scholars, whether it was up, down, or hidden, might signal mercy, allowing him to be patched up and fight another day. A thumbs down, or the more likely thumb to the throat gesture, meant death, delivered either by his opponent or by an arena attendant. For the damnatio, mercy was a rare commodity. You see the exhaustion, the terror, and the fleeting moments of defiance in the eyes of these men. They are pawns in a deadly game, their lives forfeit, their suffering a source of public amusement. The sheer waste of life is staggering, but to the Roman mind these individuals were already lost, already outside the bounds of respectable society. Their death served a purpose, to entertain, to warn, and to reinforce the social order that placed them at the very bottom. As the last of the condemned fall, or are dragged away, the crowd begins to disperse, already anticipating the next games, the next round of bloodshed. For them, it was an afternoon's entertainment. For the damnati ad ludum, it was the terrifying, violent end of a path from which there was rarely any escape. You're left standing in the now quieter arena, the silence amplifying the echoes of the recent carnage. It's a sobering reminder that even when given a sword and shield, some condemnations were simply a more protracted, more sporting form of execution, a way for Rome to wring every last drop of spectacle from a life it had deemed worthless. The distinction between damnatio ad bestias and damnatio ad ludum might seem academic to us, but for the condemned, it was the difference between being eaten by a lion or being forced to kill a fellow sufferer before likely meeting the same fate. Small comfort indeed. The brutal clamour of the arena fades into a somewhat more personal form of justice. You find yourself in a less public setting, perhaps a magistrate's court or even a private arbitration, witnessing the direct and often visceral application of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, or an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. While Rome's legal system evolved considerably over centuries, moving towards fines and other penalties for many offences, the shadow of this ancient principle lingered, particularly for certain types of personal injury or assault, especially in earlier periods, or when social status was a factor. It's the kind of justice that doesn't require a lengthy appeals process. It's immediate, tangible, and, if you're on the receiving end, exceedingly unpleasant. Imagine a legal system with a what you give is what you get returns policy, and you're not far off. The 12 tables, which we touched upon earlier, remember those foundational no-nonsense laws, explicitly laid out the principle of talio for specific injuries. For example, if one person broke another's limb, membrum ruptum, and couldn't agree on monetary compensation with the injured party, the tables allowed for retaliation in kind. So, if you broke someone's arm, and they weren't satisfied with your offer of a few shiny sesterces, they had the legal right to have your arm broken in return. It's a remarkably straightforward approach to dispute resolution, if a bit crunchy. One can only imagine the awkwardness of the negotiation. Look, about that leg I snapped. How about a lovely goat and we call it even? No? Okay, brace yourself then. You're observing a case where a citizen has accused another of a grievous personal injury, perhaps a maiming during a brawl or a deliberate act of violence. The magistrate, after hearing the evidence, might first encourage a settlement. The Romans, for all their renowned brutality in some areas, were also quite pragmatic. Monetary compensation, poena, was often preferred as it avoided escalating feuds and kept productive citizens, well, productive and intact. However, if the victim was adamant, or if the perpetrator was unable or unwilling to pay an agreed sum, the ancient right of talio could be invoked. This wasn't typically carried out by the victim themselves in a fit of passion, but was often a more formalised, judicially sanctioned act, though no less grim for the person about to lose an eye or a tooth. A mainstream historical fact is that the application of lex talionis became rarer as Roman law matured, especially for citizens. Praetors, judicial magistrates, increasingly encouraged, and then effectively mandated fixed monetary penalties for various injuries, making the system less reliant on literal physical retribution. However, the principle itself remained a potent undercurrent, a reminder of a more primal form of justice, and for non-citizens or in cases of extreme insult, it might still have been considered. The visceral nature of talio is what makes it so unsettling. It's not an abstract punishment like imprisonment or a fine that you might struggle to pay. It's a direct physical consequence, your body bearing the literal mark of your transgression. Imagine the scene, the condemned person held down, the official, or perhaps even the aggrieved party under supervision, preparing to inflict the precise injury that was originally committed. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a broken bone for a broken bone. It's a stark, brutal symmetry. Historians still argue whether the literal eye for an eye was common in practice, or if the threat of it was usually enough to compel the offender to agree to a hefty financial settlement. It's likely the latter became more prevalent over time. The option of talio acted as a powerful incentive to negotiate. After all, most people would probably prefer to part with a significant sum of money rather than an actual body part. It's the ultimate closing technique for a compensation claim. Pay up, or we redecorate your face to match your victims. One quirky or perhaps darkly humorous aspect, if such a thing is possible here, relates to the precision implied by lex talionis. If it truly was an eye for an eye, did they measure? Did they ensure the retaliatory tooth pulled was of a similar size and location to the original? The practicalities become almost absurdly macabre. One imagines a Roman official with a tiny ruler and a pair of pliers, muttering, yes, that looks like a suitable incisor. Open wide, Scipio. This level of literalism probably wasn't always the case, but the principle of exact mirrored retribution is what defined talio. This form of punishment, while seeming primitive to us, served a clear social function in its time. It aimed to limit vengeance. Instead of escalating blood feuds where a minor injury could lead to generations of reciprocal violence, talio set a specific limit. The retaliation should not exceed the original harm. It was a way of saying, this far and no further. In a society without a widespread, effective police force as we know it, such mechanisms for controlling private vengeance were crucial. You might see the fear in the eyes of the person about to suffer talio. There's no glory here, no cheering crowd like in the arena. This is a more intimate, more personal form of state-sanctioned violence. It's about balancing the scales, quite literally on the bodies of those involved, and while the trend was towards financial compensation, the fact that talio remained on the books, even as a theoretical possibility, spoke volumes about the Roman understanding of justice as something tangible, something that could be felt in the flesh. The shadow of lex talionis even extended to other areas of Roman life. For instance, the idea of proportionality in punishment, even when not literal physical retaliation, echoes this principle. The punishment should fit the crime, not in a mirror image, but in severity. So, while you might not lose an eye for stealing a loaf of bread, the concept that more serious crimes warrant more serious, and often physically painful, consequences is a thread that runs through Roman legal thought. As you turn away from this scene of stark reciprocal justice, you're reminded that the Romans, for all their sophisticated legal codes and philosophical debates, never entirely abandoned the primal urge for direct retribution. The thought of lex talionis is a chilling one. The idea that a moment of violence, a loss of control, could result in you suffering the exact same fate at the hands of the law. It certainly would make you think twice before starting a bar fight in ancient Rome, or at the very least make you very, very careful about aiming for easily replaceable parts. The intimate, personal horror of lex talionis gives way to a scene of broader, more impersonal, yet equally terrifying military discipline. You find yourself with a Roman legion, not in the heat of a glorious battle, but in its grim aftermath, or perhaps during a lull in a long, arduous campaign where morale has dangerously frayed. The air is thick with tension, not from an external enemy, but from within. A cohort, or perhaps even an entire legion, has been judged guilty of a severe offence, cowardice in the face of the enemy, mutiny, or desertion, and the punishment chosen is one of the most infamous and brutal in the Roman military handbook, decimation. Its very name, derived from the Latin for removal of a tenth, sends a shiver down your spine. It's a deadly lottery, where fate, not necessarily individual guilt, determines who will pay the ultimate price for the unit's collective failure. Imagine the scene. The legionaries, hardened soldiers who have faced death countless times, are now assembled, disarmed, their usual confident swagger replaced by a dreadful apprehension. They know what's coming. The unit to be punished is divided into groups of 10. Each group then draws lots, perhaps stones of different colours, or marks slips of papyrus. One soldier out of each group of 10, the one who draws the short straw, the black stone, the marked slip, is doomed. He is to be executed, not by some external executioner, but by the remaining 9 men of his own cohort, his own tent mates, his brothers in arms. It's a psychologically devastating tactic. Sorry, Marcus. Looks like you drew the short one. No hard feelings, right? Now, if you'll just stand still. The black humour barely masks the horror. The chosen few are then typically clubbed or stoned to death by their comrades. This wasn't a clean, swift beheading. It was a brutal, messy end delivered by the very men who had previously relied on each other for survival. The act of forcing soldiers to kill their own comrades was a masterstroke of grim psychological warfare. It aimed to instill a profound sense of collective responsibility and to make the soldiers themselves the agents of the punishment, thereby reinforcing discipline through shared trauma and guilt. It also served as a terrifying object lesson. The legion's displeasure, and by extension Rome's, could turn inwards with devastating force. A mainstream historical fact is that decimation, while notorious, was not a frequent occurrence. It was a punishment of last resort, used for the most serious collective offences when a commander felt that unit cohesion and discipline had utterly collapsed and needed to be brutally reset. Famous instances include its use by Crassus during Spartacus's revolt. Remember those crucifixions along the Appian Way? Crassus wasn't shy about harsh measures, and according to some accounts by Antony. Because of its severity and its potential to cripple a legion by killing a tenth of its fighting men and demoralising the rest, commanders used it sparingly. It was a tool so blunt, so devastating, that its very existence was often enough of a deterrent. The survivors of decimation, the 9 out of 10 in each group, were not let off scot-free. They were often forced to camp outside the main legionary fortifications, a mark of shame, and might be given rations of barley instead of the usual wheat, another sign of disgrace. They had to live with the memory of what they had done, and with the knowledge that their unit had failed so catastrophically as to warrant such a drastic measure. The bonds of camaraderie, so vital in a military unit, were deliberately frayed and then violently restitched with threads of fear and shared culpability. Historians still argue whether decimation was truly effective in the long run as a disciplinary tool, or if its brutal randomness and the resentment it could foster sometimes outweighed its shock value. While it undoubtedly instilled terror, it could also breed deep-seated bitterness. Imagine being one of the 9 who had to kill your friend, knowing it could just as easily have been you. That's a heavy burden to carry into the next battle. One quirky, or rather grimly systematic aspect of Roman military punishment beyond decimation was the sheer variety of lesser, but still harsh, penalties. For minor offences, a soldier might be flogged by the centurion, for stuarium. A beating with a cudgel could also be fatal if enough men took part. Given extra duties, have his pay docked, or be publicly shamed. For instance, a soldier might be forced to stand all day before the commander's tent without his sword belt, a sign of dishonour, or they might be subject to pecunaria mulcta, fines, or militia mutatio, reduction in rank or transfer to a less desirable unit. The Romans had a whole tariff of suffering, carefully calibrated to maintain the fighting effectiveness and unwavering obedience of their legendary legions. It wasn't all marching in neat lines and building impressive roads. There was a dark underbelly of coercive discipline. You watch as the lots are drawn, the faces of the soldiers ashen. The relief on the faces of those who draw a safe lot is palpable, quickly followed by the dreadful realization of what they must now do. The condemned man, perhaps stoic, perhaps pleading, is dragged away by his former comrades. The sounds of the executions, though somewhat muffled, are sickening. This isn't the roar of the arena or the cries from a cross. This is a more intimate, more chilling form of violence, carried out within the closed ranks of the army itself. The commander, observing from a distance, knows this is a gamble. He's sacrificing a tenth of his men to save the discipline of the remaining 9/10. It's a brutal calculation, born of the harsh realities of maintaining control over thousands of armed men, often far from home, in dangerous and stressful conditions. The message is clear. The legion is an organism, and if part of it becomes diseased through cowardice or insubordination, that part will be ruthlessly excised to preserve the whole. As the grim procedure concludes, and the remaining soldiers are left to deal with the bloody aftermath and their own shattered morale, you are struck by the cold, utilitarian logic of Roman military justice. It wasn't about individual fairness in this instance. It was about the survival and effectiveness of the legion as a fighting force. Decimation was the ultimate expression of collective punishment, a terrifying reminder that in the Roman army, the group's fate was inextricably linked, and failure had a horrifyingly random yet chillingly personal price. The ground feels unsteady beneath your feet, as if the very earth is recoiling from this brutal lottery of death. The brutal formalised violence of decimation gives way to a quieter, yet profoundly devastating form of punishment. You're no longer surrounded by the sounds of combat or execution, but by an almost unnerving silence. You see an individual, perhaps a once prominent citizen, now stripped of their toga, their symbols of status, their very identity within Roman society. They are being escorted to the city limits, or perhaps to a ship that will carry them far away. This is exile, exilium, a punishment that, for a Roman, could be a fate worse than a quick death. It wasn't just about physical removal, it was about social and civil death, a severing from everything that gave life meaning in the Roman world. Imagine being cast out not just from your home, but from your very identity, your Romanitas. It's like having your entire existence unplugged. Exile in ancient Rome took various forms ranging in severity. The mildest form might be relegatio, where a person was banished from Rome, or a particular province, for a set period or indefinitely, but retained their citizenship and property. This was bad enough, a serious blow to one's career and social standing. But the more severe form, aquae et ignis interdictio, interdiction of water and fire, was a truly catastrophic sentence. This meant being formally deprived of the basic necessities of life within Roman territory, symbolically, fire and water. Anyone who gave shelter or aid to such an exile within the prescribed boundaries could themselves face punishment. It effectively made the person an outcast, a non-entity. Their property was usually confiscated and their citizenship revoked. They became, in essence, a stateless person, with no rights, no protection under Roman law. Sorry, Publius, your Roman Express card has been declined permanently. And also, you no longer technically exist. Have a nice non-life. You watch as the exile, perhaps a politician who backed the wrong faction, a poet whose verses offended the emperor, Ovid is a famous example, banished by Augustus to Thomas on the Black Sea, or someone convicted of a serious crime short of a capital offence, takes their last look at the familiar sights of Rome. The city, once the centre of their world, is now a forbidden zone. Their friends and family might be there, watching in sorrow or perhaps with a touch of fear, knowing that association with the condemned could be dangerous. It's a lonely, heartbreaking departure. A mainstream historical fact is that exile was a common punishment for members of the elite. While lower-class criminals might face the arena or crucifixion, high-status individuals, especially those with powerful connections, were often dealt with through banishment. It was a way to remove troublesome figures from the political scene without the messiness and potential backlash of a public execution. Cicero, the great orator and statesman, famously suffered exile, though he was later recalled. His letters from this period are filled with despair and a profound sense of loss, highlighting how devastating this punishment was to the Roman psyche. The conditions of exile varied greatly. Some exiles, if they had managed to retain some wealth or had supportive connections abroad, might live in relative comfort in a pleasant Greek city or a remote villa. Others, particularly those hit with aquae et ignis interdictio and full confiscation, faced a bleak existence in harsh, unfamiliar lands, often struggling for basic survival. The psychological toll was immense. Romans were deeply tied to their city, their social networks, their political life, and their religious duties, most of which were centred in Rome. To be cut off from all of this was to lose one's place in the cosmos. Historians still argue whether the Romans viewed exile primarily as a means of removing a threat, or as a punitive act designed to inflict profound suffering. It was likely both. The practical benefit of getting rid of a political opponent or a disruptive individual was clear, but the accompanying loss of status, property, and connection to Roman society was undoubtedly intended as a severe punishment, a living death. It was a way of saying, "You're no longer one of us, you are nothing." One quirky, or rather poignant tidbit about Roman exile concerns the concept of civitas amissio, the loss of citizenship. For a Roman, citizenship was not just a legal status, it was a core part of their identity, granting them rights, privileges, and a sense of belonging to the most powerful entity in the known world. To To have it stripped away was a profound degradation. Some exiles might try to integrate into their new communities, but they would always carry the stigma of their banishment, the knowledge that they were no longer Roman. It's like having your passport revoked and your social media accounts permanently deleted by the state, all in one go. The journey into exile was often fraught with peril. Travel in the ancient world was not easy or safe, and once arrived at their designated place of banishment, often a remote, inhospitable island or a frontier town, the exile faced an uncertain future. They were at the mercy of a local governors, far from any legal recourse they might have once enjoyed in Rome. The loneliness must have been crushing. Imagine Ovid, a sophisticated urban poet, suddenly finding himself in a small, rough port on the edge of the barbarian world, surrounded by people whose language he barely understood. His poetry from exile is a testament to this profound sense of displacement and longing. You see the ship carrying the exile become a small speck on the horizon, or the lone figure trudging down a dusty road, away from everything they knew and cherished. There are no crowds baying for blood here, no immediate physical agony. But the punishment is no less severe. It's a slow, grinding erasure of a life, a condemnation to irrelevance and isolation. The Romans understood that sometimes the most effective way to destroy a person was not to kill their body, but to kill their social existence, to sever them from the intricate web of relationships, duties and privileges that constituted a Roman life. Exile was a scalpel, precisely excising an individual from the body politic, leaving a wound that, for the victim, might never truly heal. The silence left behind is heavy with the weight of a life unmade, a voice silenced, a Roman unromaned. The lonely departure of the exile fades, and you find yourself back in the bustling heart of Rome, specifically in or near the Forum, the grand stage for Roman public life. But the mood here is not one of civic pride or bustling commerce. Instead, you witness a series of punishments designed not necessarily for immediate death or permanent removal, but for public humiliation and the shattering of an individual's reputation. This is the realm of shaming rituals, punishments intended to break the spirit by exposing the offender to the contempt and ridicule of their fellow citizens. In a society as acutely conscious of honour, honos, and shame, infamia, as Rome, these could be devastatingly effective. It's like being publicly unfriended and roasted by the entire internet, but in person, and with the added bonus of potential projectiles from the crowd. You might see a debtor, unable to pay their dues, being paraded through the streets in chains, perhaps with a sign proclaiming their insolvency, or a petty thief, caught in the act, being forced to wear a placard detailing their crime, enduring the jeers and scorn of the marketplace crowd. These weren't just about announcing guilt, they were about making the offender a public spectacle, a walking embodiment of transgression. The aim was to make them feel the full weight of societal disapproval, to make their disgrace so public and memorable that they, and anyone witnessing it, would be deterred from similar actions. Look everyone, it's Gaius. He tried to sell me a three-legged chicken. Let's all point and laugh until he feels suitably ashamed of his poultry-related perfidy. One common form of public shaming involved the furkiund, a Y-shaped wooden yoke or gibbet. A person convicted of certain crimes, particularly theft by a slave or lower status individual, might be forced to carry the fur on their shoulders through the city, often while being flogged. Their hands would be tied to the outstretched arms of the yoke, making them a walking symbol of their punishment. This was a prelude to execution by crucifixion for slaves, but even for lesser offences, the public procession with the furka was a deeply humiliating experience. It was a physical manifestation of their burden of guilt, carried for all to see. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman sense of justice was heavily intertwined with social status. The type and severity of punishment, including shaming rituals, often depended on whether the offender was an honestior, person of higher status, or a humilia, person of lower status. While an honestior might face exile or a fine for a crime that could lead a humilia to the mines, the arena, or a humiliating public flogging, even the elite were not entirely immune to public disgrace. A senator found guilty of corruption, for example, might suffer damnatio memoriam, which we'll get to later, or be publicly stripped of their rank and insignia, a profound shaming before their peers. Consider the punishment for certain types of fraud or false witness. The offender might be publicly branded, literally marked for life with a symbol of their crime. This physical mark served as a permanent reminder of their untrustworthiness, making it difficult for them to engage in commerce or social interactions without their past being immediately visible. It was a way of ensuring that their shame was indelible, a constant companion. Historians still argue about the exact frequency and application of branding, and whether specific symbols were consistently used for specific crimes, but the principle of permanent visible dishonour is well attested. One quirky, or rather uncomfortably inventive, shaming punishment was reserved for those who gave false testimony in court. According to some sources, a false witness might have their belongings publicly smashed before their eyes, or even be thrown from the Tarpeian rock, a punishment we'll explore in more detail later, usually reserved for treason. More creatively, there are accounts of a talking statue, perhaps of a donkey or a figure known for folly, being used in public shaming. The guilty person might be forced to stand beside it, or it would be paraded around with their name attached, creating a mocking association. It's like an ancient Roman meme, but with much more severe social consequences. Imagine a statue of a braying ass being carted around with a sign saying, "Sextus here lied under oath. Don't be like Sextus, Sextus is an ass." The Forum itself was a key location for these rituals. This was the symbolic centre of Roman life, where important political, legal and commercial activities took place. To be shamed in the Forum was to be shamed before the very heart of Rome. The crowds that gathered for markets, court cases or public speeches would also become the audience for these punitive spectacles. Their reactions, the jeers, the insults, the tangible expressions of contempt, were an integral part of the punishment. It wasn't just the state inflicting pain or disgrace, it was the community itself participating in the reinforcement of social norms. Even military discipline had its shaming elements beyond decimation. Soldiers guilty of losing their standards in battle, a profound disgrace, might be forced to rebuild them at their own expense, or be paraded in front of their comrades in a demeaning manner. Centurions could be publicly demoted, stripped of their vine staff, their badge of office, a significant blow to their authority and pride. The psychological impact of these public shamings cannot be overstated. In a society where reputation and public standing were paramount, to be subjected to such open ridicule and condemnation could be emotionally crippling. It could lead to social ostracism, loss of livelihood, and a permanent stain on one's family honour. For some, the shame itself might have felt like a form of death. You observe these scenes of public disgrace, the discomfort almost palpable. The person being shamed often avoids eye contact, their posture slumped, their face a mask of misery. The crowd, a mixture of the curious, the scornful, and perhaps a few who feel a flicker of pity, nevertheless plays its role. This is social regulation at its most raw and visible. It's a reminder that justice in Rome wasn't always about grand pronouncements from on high. It was also about the everyday enforcement of behavioural standards, often through the powerful and deeply uncomfortable tool of public humiliation. The stones of the Forum, if they could speak, would tell countless tales of triumphs and debates, but also of these moments of profound personal abasement, where a Roman's worst fear, the loss of honour, was made agonisingly public. The sting of public shame in the Forum gradually recedes, and you find yourself confronting one of the most pervasive and grim realities of the ancient world, a state that could be both a consequence of crime and a precursor to other punishments, slavery. You observe individuals in chains, not for a temporary public shaming, but as a permanent or long-term condition. These are not just foreign captives of war, though they formed a huge portion of the enslaved population. These are also people who have fallen into servitude due to debt, or as a direct penal sentence for certain crimes. In Rome, the loss of liberty was a constant threat hanging over the heads of many, and the descent into the chains of Roman slavery was a terrifying prospect, a social and legal death that often preceded a physical one. It's like your worst nightmare of inescapable debt, but instead of collection calls, you get iron collars and a lifetime of forced labour. Roman society was fundamentally dependent on slave labour. From the grandest public works and agricultural estates, latifundia, to the most intimate domestic settings, enslaved people performed the vast majority of manual labour, and much skilled work too. A mainstream historical fact is that at the height of the empire, It's estimated that slaves might have constituted as much as 30 to 40% of the population in Italy. This enormous enslaved workforce was replenished through various means. Birth, children born to enslaved mothers were automatically slaves, regardless of the father's status, the principle of parta sequitur ventrum, capture in war, piracy, and, crucially for our purposes, as a form of punishment. You see individuals being sold in a slave market, perhaps in a corner of the forum or a dedicated marketplace. They are prodded, inspected like livestock, their teeth checked, their muscles assessed. A placard, or titulus, might hang around their necks detailing their origin, skills, and any known defects. Good for field work, prone to melancholy, answers to lucky, ironically. For those condemned to slavery due to debt, nexum in earlier periods, though this specific form of debt bondage was later reformed, the humiliation was compounded by the fact that they might have once been free citizens. Imagine the despair of a small farmer, ruined by a bad harvest or predatory lending, forced to sell himself or his children into slavery to satisfy his creditors. It was a brutal economic reality that could strip away freedom and dignity. Criminals too could be condemned to slavery, often of the harshest kind, servitus poenae, or penal servitude. This was not your relatively cushy life as a domestic slave in a wealthy household. This was often a death sentence in slow motion. Condemnation ad metallum to the mines was a particularly notorious fate. You picture the dark, cramped, dangerous conditions in Roman mines, gold, silver, copper, where enslaved people, including condemned criminals, toiled under brutal overseers, often until they died from exhaustion, accidents, or disease. There was little hope of escape or manumission from the mines. It was a one-way ticket to a subterranean hell. Similarly, condemnation ad opus publicum decens to public works could mean a life of hard labour on roads, aqueducts, or other state projects under similarly harsh conditions. Historians still argue about the degree to which enslaved people in Rome could improve their conditions or achieve manumission, release from slavery. While manumission was indeed possible, and relatively common compared to some other slave societies, especially for urban or domestic slaves who might save money or earn their freedom through loyal service, for those enslaved as a punishment, or those toiling in the mines or on large agricultural estates, the prospects were far bleaker. Their enslavement was often intended to be permanent and punitive. One quirky, or rather deeply unsettling aspect of Roman slavery was the absolute power the master, dominus, held over the slave. Legally, a slave was considered property, aoris, not a person. They could be bought, sold, gifted, inherited, tortured for testimony. A slave's evidence was only considered valid in court if extracted under torture, and killed by their master with relative impunity, especially in earlier periods. While later laws offered some minimal protections against the most extreme cruelty, the fundamental power imbalance remained. This complete lack of autonomy, this utter subjugation to another's will, was a core feature of Roman slavery. Imagine your very existence being subject to the whims, good or bad, of another human being, without any legal recourse. It's a chilling thought. You might see enslaved people performing grueling tasks under the hot sun, their bodies bearing the marks of labour and perhaps the lash. Or you might see them in a wealthy household, attending to their master's every need, their expressions carefully neutral, hiding any resentment or despair. Even for those in better slave positions, the lack of freedom, the constant threat of punishment or sale, and the separation from family were ever-present realities. The law recognised that if a slave committed a crime, the master was often held responsible, or had the option of surrendering the slave to the injured party for punishment, nox all surrender. But if a free person committed a crime that led to their enslavement, they lost all their previous rights. They became a thing, a tool, their life no longer their own. This transformation from person to chattel was one of the most profound punishments Rome could inflict. The chains you see are not just physical restraints, they are symbols of a lost life, a forfeited personhood. The clinking of those chains is a constant soundtrack to the underbelly of Roman prosperity. Without this vast pool of coerced labour, the grand monuments, the luxurious lifestyles, even the mighty legions, who relied on slaves for support services, would have been impossible. But this reliance came at an immense human cost, a cost borne by millions who were stripped of their freedom and dignity. As you observe these scenes of servitude, you are confronted with the uncomfortable truth that the glories of Rome were built quite literally on the backs of enslaved people, and for some, the path to those chains was paved by debt or by the judgment of a Roman court. It's a stark reminder that freedom, a concept we cherish, was a precarious and highly valued commodity in the ancient world, easily lost and brutally hard to regain. The weight of those chains seems to settle upon your own shoulders, a chilling empathy for those whose lives were defined by bondage in the shadow of Roman law. The clanking chains of enslavement fade, replaced by the rustle of documents and the worried murmurs of individuals facing a different, though often equally ruinous, form of Roman justice, fines and confiscations. You find yourself in a setting that might resemble a treasury office, a courtroom where financial penalties are being assessed, or perhaps witnessing the seizure of property. While perhaps not as viscerally terrifying as being thrown to lions or crucified, the economic punishments Rome could levy were potent weapons, capable of destroying fortunes, ruining families, and effectively ending a person's public life. For many, especially those in the propertied classes, the prospect of financial annihilation was a deeply feared outcome. It's like having your bank account drained, your house repossessed, and your credit score nuked from orbit, all by government decree. Roman law, from the 12 Tables onwards, made extensive use of fines, multi, for a wide range of offences. In earlier periods, these fines were often specified in terms of livestock. So many oxen for this offence, so many sheep for that. This reflects the predominantly agricultural nature of early Roman society. For example, the 12 Tables, remember our old friends, stipulated specific fines in asses, a type of bronze coin, for minor assaults, inuria, 25 asses. For a simple blow, 300 for breaking a bone of a freeman, if talio wasn't invoked and compensation was agreed. As Rome grew wealthier and its economy more complex, these fines naturally transitioned to monetary sums, often substantial ones. That illegal U-turn with your chariot is going to cost you 500 sesterces, buddy. And don't even think about appealing to Caesar. He hates bad chariot parking. Confiscation of property, publicatio bonorum, was an even more severe economic punishment, often accompanying sentences like exile, aquae et ignis interdictio, as we saw, usually meant your property was forfeit, or condemnation for major crimes like treason, maiestas. When a person's goods were confiscated, they became the property of the state treasury, aerarium, or under the emperors, the imperial treasury, a fiscus. This could mean the loss of everything: land, houses, slaves, money, businesses. For a wealthy Roman whose status and influence were inextricably linked to their property, this was a catastrophic blow. It wasn't just financial ruin, it was social and political ruin too. You observe a once prosperous merchant, his face etched with despair as officials inventory his goods for seizure. His luxurious villa, his warehouses full of imported silks and spices, his meticulously kept accounts, all are now being itemized and taken over by the state. His family faces an uncertain future, potentially cast into poverty. The meticulousness of the Roman state in such matters is chilling. They were very good at accounting, whether it was for taxes or for stripping a condemned man of his assets. A mainstream historical fact is that under some emperors, particularly during periods of political instability, or when the imperial coffers were low, accusations of treason, often flimsy, became a convenient way to confiscate the wealth of rich senators or equestrians. Informers, delatores, could profit by bringing such accusations, receiving a share of the confiscated property if the accused was convicted. This created a climate of fear and suspicion among the elite, where wealth itself could make you a target. It's a bit like a state-sponsored get-rich-quick scheme, but with much higher stakes for the accused. The proceeds from fines and confiscations served multiple purposes. They punished the offender, enriched the state, and sometimes rewarded informers. They also served as a powerful deterrent. The prospect of losing everything you've worked for or inherited would make anyone think twice about engaging in activities deemed criminal by the state, especially activities that threatened state security or the emperor's authority. Historians still argue about the extent to which the system of fines and confiscations was used purely for justice, versus for political or financial opportunism. While many fines were for legitimate recognised offences, the line could blur, especially in politically charged cases. The temptation for rulers to use legal mechanisms to eliminate opponents and seize their wealth was undoubtedly strong at times. One quirky, or perhaps just revealing aspect of Roman financial penalties relates to the concept of sacramentum. In early Roman civil procedure, both parties to a dispute might have to deposit a sum of money, the sacramentum, with the court. The loser of the case forfeited their deposit to the state, originally to the priests for religious purposes. This was not exactly a fine for a crime, but it acted as a deterrent against frivolous lawsuits and ensured that even in civil matters, the state could benefit financially from legal proceedings. It's like a court fee, but with a winner-takes-all for the state twist. The collection of these fines and the administration of confiscated property were handled by various officials. Quaestors were heavily involved in managing the state treasury. Procurators looked after imperial finances. Publicans, tax farmers, were sometimes contracted to collect certain dues, though their rapaciousness often made them deeply unpopular. The machinery of Roman financial administration was complex and, when turned to punitive ends, ruthlessly efficient. You might see individuals desperately trying to negotiate a lower fine or pleading for leniency, but the Roman state, when it came to its dues, could be implacable. The loss of property didn't just mean a reduction in lifestyle. It often meant a loss of the ability to participate in public life, to hold office, or even to maintain one's social standing. For a Roman noble, whose identity was tied to their ancestral lands and their public image, confiscation was a profound humiliation, a stripping away of the very foundations of their status. As you witness the methodical dismantling of someone's financial world, you realise that Roman power wasn't just expressed through legions and law courts in the dramatic sense. It was also wielded through account books, property registers, and the relentless collection of debts owed to the state. The pen, or rather the stylus on the wax tablet, could indeed be as mighty and as ruinous as the sword. The fear of financial ruin was a powerful tool for social control, ensuring that even those who might escape the executioner's axe or the arena's beasts could still be brought to heel by the chilling efficiency of Roman financial justice. The silence of a ledger entry marking property confiscated could be as damning as any shouted sentence. The cold, calculating world of financial ruin shifts to a scene of hushed, sacred dread. You find yourself near a place of profound religious significance in Rome, perhaps in the vicinity of the Temple of Vesta, a small, round temple in the Roman Forum. Your attention is drawn to a solemn, grim procession, unlike any you've seen before. There are no crowds baying for blood, no overt signs of physical violence yet, but the atmosphere is thick with a unique kind of horror. This is because the condemned individual is a Vestal Virgin, one of Rome's most sacred priestesses, accused of breaking her vow of chastity, a crime known as incestum, and her punishment, if found guilty, is one of the most bizarre and chilling in the Roman repertoire: to be buried alive. It's a punishment that attempts to balance the sanctity of her person. As a Vestal, her body was inviolable, with the perceived need to expunge a terrible pollution from the city. We can't shed her sacred blood, the logic seemed to go, so let's just tuck her away underground, permanently. The Vestal Virgins were a college of 6 priestesses dedicated to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Their primary duty was to maintain the sacred fire in Vesta's temple, a fire believed to be essential for the safety and continuity of Rome. They were chosen as young girls between the ages of 6 and 10 from patrician families and were required to serve for at least 30 years, during which they were bound by a strict vow of celibacy. They enjoyed extraordinary honours and privileges. They had prime seats at public games, the right to make a will, freedom from the usual patriarchal control, patria potestas, and even lictors to escort them, a right usually reserved for high magistrates. If a condemned man on his way to execution encountered a Vestal, he was automatically pardoned, a testament to their sacred status. So, they were rock stars of Roman religion, basically. However, this elevated status came with immense responsibility and terrifying consequences for transgression. If the sacred fire in Vesta's temple was allowed to go out, it was considered a dire omen for the city, and the Vestal responsible would be scourged by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, in a darkened room to preserve her modesty even during punishment. But breaking the vow of chastity, incestum, was a far graver offence. It was seen not just as a personal failing, but as a sacrilege that polluted the state and angered the gods, potentially bringing disaster upon Rome. The purity of the Vestals was directly linked to the city's well-being, so if one was found to be impure, the Romans felt extreme measures were necessary. You can imagine the citywide panic. The crops are failing. The barbarians are at the gates. Did one of the Vestals, not swipe left? You watch the procession. The accused Vestal, often dressed in funereal attire, is carried in a closed litter, as if she were already dead, to maintain the fiction that she's not being led to her punishment like a common criminal. The silence of the crowd is profound, a mixture of awe, terror, and perhaps pity. This is not a spectacle of entertainment like the arena games. This is a deeply unsettling religious ritual. The destination is a place called the Campus Sceleratus, the Field of Wickedness, located just inside the city walls near the Colline Gate. Here, a subterranean vault has been prepared. It's not simply a pit. The Romans, with their characteristic attention to ritual detail, constructed a small underground chamber, furnished with a couch, a lamp, and a meagre portion of food and drink, typically a little bread, water, milk, and oil. This is a crucial part of the bizarre logic. By providing these provisions, the Romans could claim they weren't directly killing her. She would, theoretically, die of natural causes when the provisions ran out, or perhaps by her own hand. This elaborate charade was designed to circumvent the taboo against shedding a Vestal's sacred blood or taking her life by direct violence. It's a loophole of horrifying proportions. The Pontifex Maximus presides over the grim ceremony. He utters prayers, likely absolving the city of guilt for what is about to happen. Then the condemned Vestal descends into the chamber. The entrance is then sealed, earth piled on top, and the site is left. She's alone, in the dark, with only a flickering lamp, and the knowledge that this small, furnished tomb is her final resting place. The psychological torment of this slow, lonely end is almost unimaginable. A mainstream historical fact is that the Vestal virgins served for a standard term of 30 years. The first 10 years were spent learning their duties, the next 10 performing them, and the final 10 teaching new novices. After completing their 30 years of service, a Vestal was free to leave the priesthood, return to private life, and even marry. Many who did so were highly respected and sought after as wives, given their impeccable reputation and often considerable dowries. This makes the fate of those who failed their vows even more tragic by contrast. The male party in the incestum, if identified, faced a much more straightforward, though no less brutal punishment. He was publicly flogged to death by the Pontifex Maximus in the Forum Boreum or the Comitium. No subterranean chambers or symbolic provisions for him, just a brutal, public scourging until death. This disparity highlights the unique, sacred yet vulnerable position of the Vestals themselves. Historians still argue about how frequently this live burial actually occurred. Given its extreme nature and the profound religious crisis it would represent, some scholars suggest that actual instances were rare, perhaps only a dozen or so recorded over Rome's long history. It's possible that the threat of such a horrifying punishment was often enough of a deterrent, or that accusations could be politically motivated and not always result in the ultimate penalty. The very idea of it, however, loomed large in the Roman consciousness. One quirky, or rather mythologically significant tidbit is the story of Rhea Silvia, the mother of Rome's legendary founders, Romulus and Remus. She was a Vestal virgin who was said to have been impregnated by the god Mars. While accounts of her fate vary, some say she was imprisoned, others thrown into the Tiber, her story underscores the ancient and deep-seated association of Vestal purity with the very foundations and destiny of Rome. It also highlights the severe consequences for any breach of their vows, divine intervention notwithstanding. As you stand near the now sealed Campus Sceleratus, the silence is heavier than any shout. The city of Rome, for all its pragmatic approach to law in many areas, is here revealed to be deeply enmeshed in ancient, almost primal fears of religious pollution and divine retribution. The fate of the entombed Vestal is a stark reminder of the terrifying responsibilities that came with sacred duties, and the extraordinary, almost theatrical lengths to which the Romans would go to maintain what they perceived as cosmic order. It's a punishment designed not just to end a life, but to do so in a way that acknowledged, yet horrifyingly sidestepped, the victim's sacred status, leaving her in a liminal space between life and death, sacred and defiled until the darkness claimed her completely. The soft glow of that single lamp underground seems to mock the very idea of hope. The chilling silence of the Vestal's tomb gives way to the more familiar, yet still intimidating sounds of a Roman military camp. We've touched on decimation. Remember that delightful lottery where you might have to bludgeon your best mate? But the Roman military's repertoire of punishments was far broader and more nuanced than that single infamous act. The discipline that forged the legions into the ancient world's most formidable fighting machine was relentless, and the methods used to enforce it could be both brutally effective and psychologically astute. You find yourself observing the daily life of a legion, where even minor infractions could bring a sharp, unpleasant response, a constant reminder that obedience and efficiency were paramount. It's like the strictest boarding school imaginable, but with more swords, and the detentions could be fatal. Beyond the extreme measure of decimation, Roman commanders had a graded series of punishments to maintain order and combat effectiveness. One of the most common was flogging. A soldier could be flogged by his centurion with the vites, the symbolic vine staff carried by centurions as a badge of rank and an instrument of discipline. This was often done publicly, in front of the cohort, to maximise the deterrent effect. For more serious offences, or for offences committed by auxiliaries, non-citizen soldiers, the flogging could be more severe, sometimes with the flagrum, that charming multi-thonged whip we encountered in the context of crucifixion pre-flogging. Enjoying your morning, Publius? Good. Now, about that improperly polished helmet. The centurion would like a word, and he's brought his favourite vine staff. Another common punishment was the fustuarium or bastinado. This was typically meted out for offences like falling asleep on guard duty, desertion, if not widespread enough to warrant decimation, or theft from a comrade. The condemned soldier would be touched by a centurion, and then his fellow soldiers would fall upon him with cudgels and stones. While theoretically the soldier was allowed to try and escape, if he made it out of the camp, he lived, but in disgrace and unable to return. In practice, it was often a death sentence, a brutal beating administered by his own unit. A mainstream historical fact is that this form of collective punishment, like decimation, aimed to involve the entire unit in the enforcement of discipline, fostering a sense of shared responsibility for upholding standards. Then there were the less physically brutal, but still deeply humiliating and impactful, punishments. Militia mutatio involved a reduction in rank or transfer to a less prestigious or more dangerous unit or arm of service. Imagine a proud legionary being demoted to a baggage handler, or transferred to a bleak, swampy outpost on the German frontier. Pecuniaria mulcta, fines or a stoppage of pay, was also common, hitting soldiers where it often hurt most after their pride, their wallets. Extra duties, munerum indictio, were a frequent sanction. More digging of ditches, more grinding of grain, more unpleasant latrine duty. The Roman army knew how to make life miserable for those who stepped out of line. One particularly creative form of shaming was forcing a soldier to stand all day before the praetorium, the commander's tent, sometimes in a disgraceful state of dress, perhaps without his military belt. Cingulum militar senda, a key symbol of a soldier's status, or wearing women's clothing. This public humiliation in front of his comrades was a powerful psychological tool. Historians still argue whether these shaming rituals were more effective for citizen soldiers, who had a greater sense of dignitas to lose, compared to auxiliaries who might have different cultural understandings of honour and shame. There was also the punishment of being forced to camp outside the fortified legionary camp, exposed to the elements and potential enemy attack, a clear signal of disgrace and exclusion from the fellowship of the legion. Sometimes disgraced units would be fed only barley instead of the standard wheat ration, barley being considered animal fodder by the Romans. It's like being put on the naughty step, but with the added risk of starvation or being speared by a barbarian. Sorry lads, it's barley gruel again tonight. Maybe next time you won't lose the eagle standard, eh? One quirky, or rather intensely practical aspect of Roman military justice was its swiftness. There was rarely a lengthy appeals process. The centurion or higher commander often acted as judge, jury, and sometimes even executioner, or at least ordered the punishment on the spot. This was deemed necessary to maintain immediate control and obedience, especially on campaign or in hostile territory. Justice delayed was discipline denied. The system wasn't entirely arbitrary, however. There were military laws and customs, and soldiers did have some avenues for complaint, especially if they felt a commander was being excessively or unjustly cruel. Mutinies, though rare and brutally suppressed when they occurred, often with decimation, sometimes happened when legions felt their customary rights or pay were being infringed. The relationship between a commander and his troops was a delicate balance of authority, respect, and fear. You observe a centurion, his face like granite, dressing down a trembling recruit who perhaps fumbled a drill or showed a moment's hesitation. The threat of the vitis is ever present. You see another group of soldiers engaged in some particularly arduous and unpleasant fatigue duty, their expressions sullen but resigned. This is the engine room of Roman military might, kept running not just by training and esprit de corps, but by a constant underlying current of strict, often harsh discipline. The effectiveness of the Roman legions was not just due to their superior tactics, equipment, or engineering skills. It was also a result of this relentless internal pressure to conform, to obey, to perform. Every soldier knew the potential consequences of failure, from a stinging blow with a vine staff to a brutal death at the hands of his comrades. It's a sobering thought that the glory of Rome's armies was built upon such a foundation of coercion and fear, as much as upon bravery and skill. The polish on their armour was matched by the sharpness of their disciplinary tools. The sting of Roman military justice was a constant companion to every soldier, from the rawest recruit to the seasoned veteran. The rigid discipline of the military camp gives way to a scene filled with a different kind of dread, illuminated by the flickering, hungry light of flames. You are witnessing a punishment that speaks to primal fears and offers a horrifying spectacle: death by burning on the pyre. This method of execution, known as vivicumburium or being crematus igni, was not as uniquely Roman as the poinacole, nor as iconic as crucifixion, but it was a recognised part of their punitive arsenal reserved for crimes considered particularly heinous or polluting, such as arson, a bit of ironic justice there, treason, desertion by slaves, and, notably in later periods, for followers of forbidden religions like Christianity. There's a terrifying finality to fire, an obliteration that leaves little behind, and the Romans, with their flair for dramatic punishments, certainly understood its impact. It's like the ultimate bad barbecue, and you, unfortunately, are the main course. You see a large pile of wood, a pyre, constructed in a public place, perhaps an open square or just outside the city walls. The condemned individual or individuals are being led towards it. Their faces are often a mixture of terror and resignation. The crowd gathered to watch is more subdued than the arena crowds, perhaps, the mood tinged with a more sombre awe at the destructive power about to be unleashed. Fire, after all, was both a vital tool for civilization. Remember the sacred fire of Vesta, and a terrifying force of nature when uncontrolled. To deliberately consign a living human being to its embrace was a powerful statement. The condemned were typically stripped of their outer clothing and bound to a stake in the centre of the pyre, or sometimes simply thrown onto the burning pile. The aim was not a quick death. Unless the fire was expertly built and managed for intense immediate heat, which was not always the priority, death would come slowly from a combination of burns, heat stroke, smoke inhalation, and carbon monoxide poisoning. The suffering would be intense and visible, a key component of its deterrent effect. Let this be a lesson to all you potential fire starters and heretics. We have plenty of wood, and we're not afraid to use it. A public service announcement Rome style. A mainstream historical fact is that death by burning became an increasingly common punishment for Christians, especially during periods of state-sanctioned persecution, like those under Emperors Nero, Decius, or Diocletian. Christians who refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods or the emperor's genius, his divine spirit, were often accused of atheism for denying the Roman gods, and treason for disrespecting the emperor's divinity. Crimes deemed worthy of exemplary punishment. Figures like Polycarp of Smyrna are famously recorded as having been martyred by fire. The theatricality of the burning, and the steadfastness of some martyrs in the face of it, ironically, sometimes had the opposite effect to what was intended, inspiring awe or sympathy rather than just terror. The choice of burning as a punishment often had symbolic resonance. For arsonists, it was a form of talia, an eye for an eye, or in this case, fire for fire. For those accused of religious offences or magic, fire was seen as a purifying element, capable of destroying the spiritual contagion they were believed to represent. The complete destruction of the body by fire also served to deny a proper burial, which, as we've seen, was a significant additional punishment in Roman eyes, believed to affect the deceased's peace in the afterlife. Historians still argue about the precise legal basis and frequency of burning for different crimes throughout Roman history. While it was clearly used, its application seems to have varied depending on the era, the specific crime, and the social status of the offender. For example, honestiores, the upper classes, were generally less likely to be burned alive than humiliores, the lower classes, for similar offences, though exceptions were made for crimes like treason or magic, which were seen as threatening the very fabric of the state. One quirky, or rather grimly inventive, variation of death by burning was the tunica molesta, which we briefly encountered in the context of damnatio ad bestias. This was a garment, a tunic, smeared with pitch, wax, resin, or other flammable substances. The condemned person was forced to wear it, and then it was set alight. They would become a human torch, running in agony until they collapsed. This was sometimes used as a form of gruesome entertainment in the arena, or during public festivals, particularly under emperors like Nero, who famously used Christians as living torches to illuminate his garden parties. It's a level of cruelty that is hard to comprehend, turning human suffering into a grotesque form of party decoration. The smell of burning wood, and then something far more sickening, fills the air. The crackling of the flames, the occasional screams or groans of the victims, and the hushed horror of the crowd create a deeply unsettling sensory experience. The heat from the pyre can be felt even from a distance, a reminder of the terrifying power being wielded. This is not a clean or swift execution. It is a primal and brutal spectacle, designed to invoke fear and to demonstrate the state's absolute power over life and death, even to the point of complete annihilation by one of nature's most destructive forces. As the flames die down and only smoking embers and charred remains are left, a sense of grim finality settles over the scene. The individual is gone, reduced to ash, their crime and their suffering a stark warning to those who remain. The Romans understood that some messages needed to be delivered with an unforgettable fiery emphasis. The pyre, therefore, remained a potent symbol of retributive justice, and a tool for purging those elements deemed too dangerous or too impure to be allowed to exist within the Roman world. The acrid smoke that drifts away carries with it the scent of absolute power and the terror of a fiery judgment. The acrid smoke of the pyre dissipates, and you find yourself confronted with a punishment that aimed not just at the body, but at the very memory and legacy of an individual. Damnatio memoriae. This Latin phrase translates to condemnation of memory. It wasn't an execution of the physical person, though it often followed an execution or the death of a disgraced individual, but rather an attempt by the state, usually the Senate or the Emperor, to officially erase a person from history, to obliterate their name and image from public life, as if they had never existed. This was typically reserved for those deemed traitors, public enemies, or disgraced emperors. It's like being retroactively cancelled by the most powerful empire on earth with extreme prejudice and a chisel. Gaius Julius who? Never heard of him. And why is there a suspicious blank space on this inscription? Imagine the scene. Workers are systematically chiselling names from public inscriptions on buildings, monuments, and triumphal arches. Statues are being pulled down, their heads sometimes recarved to represent someone else, or simply smashed. Coins bearing the image of the condemned individual are recalled or defaced. Portraits in public and even private homes might be destroyed or altered. Wills could be annulled, and their children might suffer legal disadvantages or be forced to change their names. The goal was a comprehensive, systematic erasure. It was an attempt to control history, to rewrite the public narrative by removing offending characters. A mainstream historical fact is that many Roman emperors suffered damnatio memoriae after their deaths, especially those who were overthrown, assassinated, or ruled tyrannically. Famous examples include Nero, Domitian, Caligula, Elagabalus, and Geta, whose memory was damned by his own brother and co-emperor Caracalla after Caracalla murdered him. Talk about sibling rivalry. However, the effectiveness of damnatio memoriae was often limited. While official inscriptions and public statues might be altered, private memories and written accounts, like those of historians, often persisted, sometimes even ensuring that the condemned person was remembered because of the attempt to erase them. It's the ultimate Streisand effect, ancient Roman style. You might observe a stonecutter carefully removing the name of a disgraced general from a public monument. The precision of the work is chilling, not just crude vandalism, but a deliberate sanctioned act of historical editing. Or you might see a crowd watching as a once imposing bronze statue of a hated emperor is toppled and dragged through the streets, a potent symbol of a fallen regime and a repudiated legacy. The act itself was a form of public spectacle, reinforcing the condemnation and signalling a change in power or public sentiment. Historians still argue about the true motivations and intended audience of damnatio memoriae. Was it primarily to appease the populace after a period of tyranny? Was it a tool for new rulers to legitimize their own power by denigrating their predecessors? Or was it genuinely believed that such an act could somehow magically undo the influence or pollution of the condemned individual? It was likely a complex mixture of all these elements, a political statement, a psychological release for the public, and a superstitious attempt to cleanse the state. One quirky, or rather telling aspect of damnatio memoriae is how it reveals the Roman obsession with fame, reputation, and legacy. For a Roman elite, to be remembered well by posterity, to have one's name and achievements celebrated, was a driving ambition. The prospect of having that memory deliberately and officially destroyed was therefore a terrifying one. It was a punishment that struck at the very heart of Roman aristocratic values. It wasn't just about being forgotten, it was about being actively unremembered, if such a thing is possible. The void left by the erased name was intended to be as loud as any shouted condemnation. The process of damnatio memoriae wasn't always perfectly consistent or thorough. Sometimes names were only partially erased, or statues were hidden away rather than completely destroyed. The vastness of the empire also made complete erasure a logistical challenge. A name might be meticulously removed in Rome, but inscriptions in a remote province might survive untouched for centuries, providing vital clues for later historians. This patchy application sometimes leads to fascinating archaeological puzzles, as scholars try to reconstruct who was condemned and why, based on these ghostly absences and alterations. You might see a family discreetly trying to preserve a small portrait or a document bearing the name of a condemned relative, knowing the risks involved. The private sphere was harder for the state to control completely, and sometimes a later regime might reverse a damnatio memoriae, rehabilitating the memory of a previously condemned individual if it suited their political purposes. History, in Rome, was clearly a battlefield, and memory was a weapon. As you witness these attempts to edit the past, to chisel away at inconvenient truths or disgraced legacies, you are struck by the audacity of it, the belief that human beings can control not only the present and the future, but also what is remembered of what has gone before. Damnatio memoriae is a powerful testament to the Roman understanding of history as a construct, something that could be shaped and reshaped according to the needs of the powerful. It's a chilling reminder that even after death, your reputation, your very existence in the annals of time, could be subject to the judgment and revision of those who came after. The blank spaces on the monuments speak volumes, whispering of power, disgrace, and the eternal struggle over who gets to tell the story. The attempts to erase memory fade, and you realise that in ancient Rome, not even the finality of death was necessarily an escape from the reach of justice, or at least from punitive action. You're now confronting the concept of posthumous punishments, actions taken against the body or reputation of someone already deceased. This might seem redundant. What's the point of punishing a corpse? But for the Romans, with their deep concern for proper burial rites, ancestral honour, and the fate of the soul in the afterlife, these actions carried significant weight. It was a way of extending condemnation beyond the grave, ensuring that the infamy of certain individuals resonated even in death, and perhaps served as a more enduring warning to the living. It's like getting a parking ticket on your hearse, only far more serious and with eternal consequences. We've already touched upon some aspects of this. damnatio memoriae, remember the chisels and toppled statues, was often enacted posthumously. Leaving the bodies of crucified criminals or those killed by beasts in the arena to rot unburied was another form of posthumous dishonour, denying them the rites considered essential for peace in the afterlife. But the Romans had other, more specific ways of extending punishment beyond the veil of death. You might witness the body of a condemned traitor, someone who perhaps took their own life to escape a trial or execution, being dragged through the streets by a hook. This was a common practice, particularly for enemies of the state. The unceremonious dragging of the corpse, often to the Tiber River where it would be unceremoniously dumped, was a final act of degradation. The Gemonian stairs, Scalae Gemoniae, a flight of steps leading from the Capitoline Hill to the Forum, became notorious as a place where the bodies of executed or disgraced individuals were exposed and then often cast into the river. It was a public spectacle of ultimate contempt. Look at what happens to those who defy Rome. Not even in death will they find dignity, the silent message screamed. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman law, particularly in cases of treason, maiestas, allowed for the trial and condemnation of a deceased person if they died before a verdict could be reached, or even if the charges were brought after their death. If convicted, their property could still be confiscated and their memory damned. This ensured that the financial and reputational consequences of their alleged crimes would still impact their heirs and their legacy. It also meant that accusations could be conveniently brought against wealthy individuals after their death, with their estate being the primary target. The treatment of the corpse itself could vary. Beyond being dragged and dumped, bodies might be mutilated. Suicides, in particular, were often viewed with suspicion or contempt, especially if the suicide was seen as an attempt to evade justice and preserve property for their family, as suicide before conviction sometimes, but not always, prevented confiscation. The body of a suicide might be denied normal funeral rites, or even subjected to specific indignities. Historians still argue about the precise religious beliefs underpinning these posthumous punishments. While the denial of burial was clearly linked to beliefs about the unhappy fate of unburied souls, becoming restless ghosts or lemures, the motivation for mutilating or abusing a corpse might also have been rooted in a more primal desire to utterly destroy and defile the enemy, to express ultimate power over them. It was a visceral, symbolic act of annihilation. One quirky, or rather macabre aspect of Roman attitudes towards death, and the dead, is the concept of the mundus cereris. This was a pit or underground chamber in Rome, ritually opened 3 times a year. It was believed to be a gateway to the underworld, and during these times it was said that the spirits of the dead could roam the earth. While not directly a punishment, it shows the Roman preoccupation with the boundary between the living and the dead, and the potential for the deceased to still interact with, or influence, the world of the living. Denying someone a proper place in that underworld through posthumous dishonour was therefore a serious matter. Imagine the family of someone who has been posthumously condemned. Not only do they have to deal with the grief of loss and the shame of conviction, but they might also be denied the right to mourn publicly or to perform the necessary funeral rites. Their ancestral tombs might be forbidden to receive the body. This was a profound disruption to Roman family traditions and religious obligations. It was a punishment that echoed down through generations, staining the family name. Sorry, your great-uncle Tiberius was declared an enemy of the state last week, even though he died 5 years ago. So, no more lovely family picnics at his mausoleum, and we've had to rename the prize-winning rose after someone less treasonous. The desecration of tombs, while generally a crime in itself, crimen violati sepulchri, could also occur as a form of unofficial, or sometimes even sanctioned posthumous punishment, especially in times of civil unrest or intense political hatred. The memory of a hated figure might be attacked by defacing their tomb or scattering their ashes. As you observe these grim practices, the dragging of lifeless bodies, the denial of sacred rites, the legal pursuit of the dead, you are struck by the lengths to which Roman justice or vengeance could go. It wasn't enough to defeat or kill an enemy. Their very essence, their place in society and in the afterlife, had to be attacked. This demonstrates a profound belief in the enduring power of reputation and the interconnectedness of the living and the dead. For the Romans, death was not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It was merely another state in which one's actions in life could continue to have very real, very unpleasant consequences. The grave offered no certain sanctuary from the long arm, and even longer memory of Roman condemnation. The grim thought of posthumous punishments lingers, but your attention is now drawn to a specific precipitous location within Rome itself, the Tarpeian Rock. This was a steep cliff on the southern side of the Capitoline Hill, overlooking the Forum. It wasn't just a geographical feature, it was an infamous site of execution, a place from which individuals condemned for certain serious crimes against the state were thrown to their deaths. It's a punishment that combines public spectacle with a fatal fall, a dramatic and often politically charged end. Imagine the final, terrifying moments, the rush of air, and the brutal impact. A very literal downfall for those who betrayed Rome. For your crime of treason, we sentence you to a brief flight, followed by an abrupt meeting with the Forum. No refunds on the landing. The Tarpeian Rock was named, according to legend, after Tarpeia, a Vestal virgin. Yes, them again, they pop up in the most dramatic stories, who, during the Sabine siege of Rome in its earliest days, betrayed the city by offering to open the gates to the Sabine attackers, in exchange for what they wore on their arms, meaning their gold bracelets. The Sabines, after gaining entry, either crushed her under their shields, which they also wore on their arms, a bit of a deadly pun there, or, in some versions, threw her from this very rock. Thus, her name became forever associated with treason, and its ultimate punishment at this site. It's a foundational myth that underscores the severity with which Rome viewed betrayal from within. This method of execution, being hurled from a height, was reserved for particularly heinous crimes, most notably treason, per duello, or later maiestas, but also sometimes for desertion, incest, in the broader Roman sense, not just vestal unchastity, or even for giving false testimony, as we briefly noted. It was a punishment that carried a heavy symbolic weight. The Capitoline Hill was the religious and defensive heart of Rome, home to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. To be cast from its sacred precinct was a powerful statement of exclusion and execration. It was as if the city itself was vomiting out the traitor. You stand in the Forum below, looking up at the formidable cliff, or perhaps you are among the guards escorting a condemned prisoner to the summit. The prisoner is likely already in a state of terror. This isn't a quick beheading or a structured fight in the arena. This is a brutal, primitive form of execution, relying on gravity and hard stone. The fall itself would be terrifying, and death upon impact or shortly thereafter from injuries was almost certain. The public nature of it, visible from the bustling Forum, served as a stark warning. A mainstream historical fact is that the Tarpeian Rock was used as a place of execution for centuries, from the early Republic well into the imperial period. While other methods of execution became more common for certain crimes, the rock retained its symbolic significance for acts of ultimate betrayal against the Roman state. Notable figures, or those accused of aspiring to tyranny, sometimes met their end here. For example, Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, a hero who had once saved Rome from a Gallic knight attack on the capital, was later accused of aiming at kingly power and was thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a dramatic reversal of fortune, from saviour of the capital to its victim. The act of throwing someone from the rock was not necessarily a lengthy or elaborate ritual. The condemned would be brought to the edge and then simply pushed or thrown over. There was a brutal efficiency to it. The crowd below might watch in silence, or perhaps with jeers, depending on the popularity or lack thereof of the condemned. The body, once it landed, would likely be a broken mess, a grim testament to the state's power to inflict a sudden and shattering end. Historians still argue about the precise criteria for who was subjected to this punishment versus other capital penalties, particularly in the later Republic and Empire when the legal system became more complex. It seems to have retained a certain archaic flavour, invoked for crimes that struck at the very foundations of Roman identity and security, where a particularly dramatic and symbolic form of retribution was deemed necessary. One quirky, or rather grimly practical detail concerns the aftermath. What happened to the bodies? Often, as with other public executions, they might be left exposed for a time, further emphasising the disgrace before being disposed of, perhaps by being dragged to the Tiber. There was no dignified funeral for those who met their end on the Tarpeian Rock. Their final resting place was the hard ground of the Forum, or the murky waters of the river. The psychological impact of this punishment was significant. For a Roman citizen, particularly one of high standing, to be executed in such a manner was the ultimate ignominy. It was a complete inversion of their status, a public declaration that they were no longer worthy to stand upon Roman soil, let alone the sacred Capitoline. The fear of such a death, and the accompanying disgrace, was a powerful deterrent against treasonous thoughts or actions. As you imagine the scene, the condemned person at the precipice, the vastness of the sky above and the hard reality of the forum below, you can almost feel the vertigo, the sense of impending doom. The Tarpeian Rock stands as a stark physical monument to Roman justice in its most unforgiving form. It's a reminder that for certain crimes there was no appeal, no mercy, only a swift and brutal descent into oblivion, a public spectacle designed to reinforce the inviolability of the Roman state and the terrible price of betraying it. The echo of those final screams, or perhaps just the sickening thud, would have resonated long in the memory of those who witnessed it. The terrifying plunge from the Tarpeian Rock gives way to a less immediately violent, yet in many ways equally devastating social and legal punishment, the imposition of infamia. This Latin term doesn't translate neatly, but it essentially means public disgrace, dishonour, or a loss of legal standing and reputation. It wasn't a physical punishment in itself, though it often accompanied or resulted from other punishments, but rather a legal and social stain that could cripple an individual's ability to function in Roman society. If Rome was a complex game of social snakes and ladders, infamia was landing on a giant snake that took you right out of the game, or at least relegated you to the sidelines permanently. It was a kind of civil death, stripping away rights and respectability. You observe individuals who, though physically unharmed, move through the city like ghosts. They are marked, not necessarily with a brand, but with an invisible yet deeply felt stigma. Infamia could be incurred for a variety of reasons. Certain professions were inherently considered infamous, such as actors, gladiators, even the successful ones despite their popular appeal, prostitutes, and pimps. It could also result from specific actions or convictions. Being found guilty of certain crimes like theft, fraud, or adultery, being dismissed dishonourably from the army, or engaging in behaviour deemed grossly immoral or contrary to Roman dignity, dignitas, like a man willingly prostituting himself. Even certain legal actions like being declared a bankrupt or having a guardian removed for misconduct could lead to infamias. Oh, you want to be an actor, Lucius? Splendid. Just be aware that society will consider you on par with a pickpocket and you won't be able to, say, testify in court or hold public office. Break a leg, though. The consequences of infamia were severe and wide-ranging. A person branded with infamia suffered a diminution of their legal rights, capitis diminutio minima. They typically could not hold public office, vote in certain assemblies, act as a witness in court, or their testimony would carry less weight, represent others in legal proceedings, or make certain types of contracts. They were, in effect, second-class citizens or worse. Their ability to engage in commerce, to protect their interests through the legal system, and to participate in the civic life of Rome was severely curtailed. A mainstream historical fact is that the concept of infamia was formally recognised and enforced by the praetor's edict. The praetor, a key judicial magistrate in Rome, would publish an edict at the beginning of his term outlining the legal principles he would follow. This edict often included a list of individuals or categories of people who were considered infamous, and would therefore be subject to certain legal disabilities. This made infamia not just a matter of social opinion, but a formal legal status with tangible consequences. You might see a former senator convicted of corruption, and now living under the shadow of infamia. He can no longer enter the Senate House, his peers shun him, his powerful voice in public affairs is silenced, or you see an actor celebrated on stage for his skill, but unable to shake off the social taint of his profession once he steps out of the theatre. It was a paradox of Roman society. They loved the entertainment provided by actors and gladiators, but often despised the entertainers themselves, or at least considered them morally compromised. Historians still argue about the precise social mechanisms through which infamia operated, and how strictly its legal consequences were always applied. Was it an absolute bar, or were there degrees of infamia and ways to mitigate its effects, perhaps through wealth or powerful patronage? It likely varied depending on the specific cause of the infamia, the individual's existing social network, and the prevailing social climate. However, the general principle remained. Infamia was a serious black mark. One quirky, or rather telling example of how infamia could affect daily life relates to marriage and inheritance. Certain categories of infamous persons might be restricted in whom they could marry, or their ability to inherit property might be impacted. For instance, under the Augustan marriage laws, designed to encourage procreation among the upper classes, senators and their descendants were forbidden from marrying individuals deemed infamous, like actresses. This was to prevent the pollution of noble bloodlines. It's like a dating app with a very aggressive filter based on your legal and social standing. The psychological burden of infamia must have been immense. In a society that placed such a high value on honour, reputation and public participation, to be officially branded as dishonourable was a crushing blow. It meant living with constant social disapproval, with doors closed to you, with your word doubted and your very presence potentially considered offensive. It was a lifelong sentence of social marginalisation. Infamia could also be a component of other punishments. For example, if someone was condemned ad ludum to the gladiatorial school, remember, even if they somehow survived and gained their freedom, they would likely still carry the stain of infamia due to their association with the arena. Similarly, someone exiled and then later recalled might still find their reputation permanently damaged. As you observe these individuals navigating their diminished existence, you realise that Roman punishment wasn't always about spectacular violence. The quiet, insidious destruction of a person's legal and social standing could be just as effective in neutralising them and serving as a warning to others. Infamia was a powerful tool for enforcing social norms and maintaining hierarchies. It was a way for the Roman state and society to define who belonged, who was respectable, and who was to be excluded from the full benefits and dignities of Roman life. The mark of infamia, though invisible, was a heavy burden to bear, a constant reminder of one's fall from grace in the eyes of Rome. The subtle but crushing weight of infamia recedes, and you find yourself in a tense, almost paranoid atmosphere, perhaps a courtroom or an interrogation chamber, where accusations of sorcery, witchcraft, or poisoning are being investigated. The Romans, for all their pragmatism and sophisticated legal structures, harboured a deep-seated fear of illicit magic, maleficium, and deadly toxins. Accusations of these crimes could trigger intense public anxiety and lead to severe, often brutal punishments. This wasn't just about punishing a demonstrable harm, it was about combating perceived supernatural threats and insidious hidden dangers that could undermine individuals, families, or even the state itself. It's like a city-wide witch hunt, but with togas and a much more direct approach to evidence gathering, often involving torture. Poisoning, beneficium, was considered a particularly heinous crime, often linked in the Roman mind with women and with stealthy domestic treachery. It was seen as a cowardly and unnatural way to kill, subverting the more honourable, if one can use that term, methods of open violence. Accusations of poisoning could arise from sudden or unexplained deaths, and public panic could easily set in, leading to widespread accusations and summary justice, especially in earlier periods. Livy, the Roman historian, recounts a famous, though possibly legendary episode from 331 BC, where a large number of Roman matrons were supposedly found guilty of mass poisoning and executed, highlighting the deep anxieties surrounding this crime. "My husband died suddenly after dinner. It must have been that new spice seller. Or perhaps his ambitious aunt who always coveted our prize-winning dormouse farm." To the courts, sorcery, witchcraft, and the casting of harmful spells, carmina, were also viewed with extreme suspicion and fear. While Romans themselves practiced various forms of official, state-sanctioned divination and religious ritual, remember the Vestals and their sacred fire, or the augurs interpreting bird flight. They drew a sharp distinction between good religion and bad magic. Maleficium, harmful magic intended to cause illness, death, crop failure, or to manipulate emotions, was rigorously prosecuted. This could include anything from making curse tablets, defixions, small sheets of lead inscribed with curses and often buried near the intended victim or in graves, to alleged love potions that went wrong, or rituals believed to invoke malevolent spirits. You observe an individual, perhaps an old woman living on the fringes of society, or a foreigner with unfamiliar customs being accused of witchcraft. The evidence might be flimsy, hearsay, strange objects found in their possession, or the misfortune of a neighbour. But in an atmosphere of fear, such evidence could be enough to secure a conviction. Torture was often used to extract confessions, not just from slaves, whose testimony, as we know, was usually only considered valid if obtained under duress, but sometimes even from lower-class free persons accused of magic. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman laws against magic and poisoning became increasingly severe over time, especially under the Empire. The 12 Tables already contained provisions against casting harmful spells on crops. Later laws, like the Lex Cornelia, De Sicarius et Beneficis, Cornelian law on assassins and poisoners, enacted by Sulla in 81 BC, prescribed harsh penalties, often death, for those found guilty of these crimes. Emperors, particularly those who felt insecure or were prone to paranoia, often cracked down hard on astrologers, diviners, if not state-sanctioned, and anyone suspected of using magic for political purposes, such as trying to foretell the emperor's death or harm him through supernatural means. The punishments for convicted poisoners or sorcerers were among the most severe Rome could devise. They might be thrown to wild beasts, damnatio ad bestias, crucified, or burned alive. Remember the pyre? A popular choice for those deemed supernaturally tainted. The method of execution often aimed at utter destruction or purification, to eliminate the perceived magical contamination. There was little room for leniency when the state felt threatened by these hidden, insidious forces. Historians still argue about the extent to which accusations of sorcery and poisoning were used as a pretext to eliminate personal enemies or to confiscate property. Given the vague nature of magic and the ease with which accusations could be made, it's certainly plausible that such charges were sometimes weaponized for ulterior motives. An unexplained illness or a sudden death could easily be blamed on a disliked neighbour or a wealthy individual whose estate was coveted. One quirky, or rather revealing aspect of Roman trials for magic is the focus on the physical objects associated with the alleged sorcery. Curse tablets, strange figurines, knotted cords, potions, and powders. These would be brought into court as damning evidence. The Romans had a very tangible, almost materialistic view of how magic worked. It wasn't just about intent, it was about the physical tools and ingredients used to channel supernatural power. You can imagine a lawyer dramatically presenting a suspiciously lumpy voodoo doll. "Behold, senators!" This grotesque effigy, found buried in my client's garden, clearly intended to cause his prize-winning figs to wither. The defendant is clearly a fig-hating sorcerer of the worst kind. The fear of poisoning was so pervasive that wealthy Romans often employed food tasters, praegustatores. Emperors, in particular, lived in constant fear of assassination by poison, and their tasters were crucial members of their household staff. The existence of this profession speaks volumes about the perceived threat levels. As you witness these trials, the intense fear and suspicion in the room are almost palpable. It's a reminder that beneath the veneer of Roman rationality and legal order, ancient anxieties about the unseen, the uncontrollable, and the malevolent could easily surface, leading to brutal and often unjust consequences. The very air seems charged with suspicion, where a misunderstood gesture, an unusual remedy, or a personal grudge could escalate into a capital charge. The trials for sorcery and poisoning reveal a darker, more fearful side of the Roman psyche, one where the shadows held not just criminals, but demons and deadly toxins, and the state responded with its most terrifying forms of justice. The shadowy fears of sorcery trials recede, and you find yourself taking a step back, looking not at a single punishment, but at the broader landscape of Roman penal thought and its enduring, often unsettling legacy. As our journey through the most bizarre and brutal punishments of ancient Rome draws to a close for tonight, it's worth reflecting on how these methods, born of a specific time and culture, nevertheless cast long shadows, influencing legal systems and concepts of justice for centuries to come. The Romans, with their characteristic thoroughness, didn't just invent ways to build empires and aqueducts. They also, inadvertently or intentionally, laid down patterns for how states could use punishment to maintain order, express outrage, and control populations. It's like they left behind not just ruins of stone, but also blueprints for social control, some of which, disconcertingly, still resonate. The Roman emphasis on public spectacle and punishment is one such enduring legacy. From the crucifixions lining the Appian Way, remember Spartacus's doomed followers, to the gruesome entertainments of the arena, damnatio ad bestias, or condemned gladiators, the Romans understood that punishment was most effective as a deterrent when it was visible, memorable, and terrifying. This idea of public execution as a warning to others persisted in many societies long after Rome itself had fallen. The town square hangings, the drawing and quartering, the public stocks, these all echo that Roman understanding of justice as a performance, designed to edify and intimidate the populace. Come one, come all, see the consequences of crime, popcorn half price before the disemboweling, a sentiment that thankfully has largely faded, but its roots are deep. The concept of varying punishments based on social status, so prevalent in Rome, where honestiores often received more dignified penalties than humiliors for the same crime, also found echoes in later legal systems, albeit often in more subtle forms. While modern Western law strives for equality before the law, the historical reality is that wealth, status, and connections have often influenced the type and severity of justice meted out. The Roman system was just more explicit about it. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman law itself, particularly as codified in Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis in the 6th century AD, became a foundational pillar of many Western European legal systems. While the specific brutal punishments we've explored were largely, though not entirely, abandoned or transformed over time, Roman legal concepts regarding property, contracts, and procedure deeply influenced the development of civil law traditions that continue to this day in many parts of the world. So, even as we recoil from their methods of punishment, we must acknowledge their profound legal intellect in other areas. The idea of infamia, that lovely social and legal stain we discussed, also has modern parallels. While we may not have formal legal categories of infamous persons in the same way, the concept of a ruined reputation, of social ostracism due to past crimes or scandalous behaviour is still very much alive. Cancel culture, in its own way, can be seen as a distant, digitally mediated cousin of infamia, where public condemnation can lead to severe social and professional consequences, even without formal legal action. Historians still argue about whether the extreme brutality of Roman punishments was a sign of a fundamentally cruel society, or a pragmatic, if harsh, response to the challenges of maintaining order in a vast, diverse, and often violent empire without modern policing or communication technologies. Was it sadism, or a desperate attempt at social control? Perhaps it was a complex and uncomfortable mixture of both. The Romans were capable of great sophistication and great brutality, often side by side. One quirky, or rather sobering thought is how some Roman punitive concepts have been unconsciously absorbed. The very idea of imprisonment as a primary form of punishment, while not as central to the Romans as it is to us, they preferred quicker, more corporeal or financial penalties, did exist in the form of holding cells awaiting trial or execution, or penal servitude in mines or public works, which was essentially enslavement combined with hard labour. The modern penitentiary system, for all its differences, still serves that Roman function of removing undesirables from society, albeit with a theoretical aim towards rehabilitation that was largely absent in Roman thought for most crimes. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, attempting to erase individuals from history, finds strange echoes in modern attempts to rewrite narratives, topple statues of controversial historical figures, or deplatform individuals from public discourse. While the motivations and methods are vastly different, the underlying impulse to control memory and public representation has a long, Roman-tinged pedigree. As you reflect on the sack with its animal companions, the slow agony of the cross, the roar of the arena, the loneliness of exile, the terror of the pyre, and the chilling finality of the Tarpeian rock, you're witnessing not just isolated acts of cruelty, but components of a system. It was a system that, for all its barbarity by our standards, successfully maintained Roman dominance for centuries. Their punishments were often bizarre, disproportionate, and terrifyingly inventive, but they were rarely random in their strategic intent. They were tools wielded to protect the state, enforce social hierarchies, and make an unforgettable impression on anyone who might consider stepping out of line. The journey through Rome's shadowy penal landscape has been a long and at times unsettling one. It reminds us that concepts of justice, cruelty, and what constitutes bizarre are deeply conditioned by time and culture. The Romans, our ancient forebears in so many ways, also offer a stark lesson in how power can be maintained through fear and how human ingenuity can be applied to the infliction of suffering just as readily as to the creation of beauty or order. Their world was one of great light and profound darkness, and their punishments stand as a chilling testament to that duality. And now, as our exploration of Rome's more inventive forms of justice concludes, allow the disquieting images to begin to soften and fade. The sharp edges of the arena, the chilling draught from the executioner's cliff, the suffocating confines of the sack, let them recede into the mists of history. These practices, however unsettling to our modern sensibilities, belong to a world vastly different from our own, a world grappling with its own unique challenges and understanding of order. The echoes of their harsh decrees and the spectral figures of the condemned can now drift away, leaving behind only the quiet hum of your own, safe present. Know that the journey through these dark corridors of the past is over for tonight. The purpose was not to dwell in the macabre, but to understand, to gain a little perspective on the long and often winding road of human civilization, and perhaps to appreciate the protections, however imperfect, that our own era affords. Let the knowledge settle, but let the discomfort ease. You're far removed from those ancient terrors, secure in the quiet of your own space. The shadows of Rome can no longer reach you here. Sweet dreams.